In June 1967, the Middle East stood on a knife's edge, and the world watched with held breath as armies mobilized, speeches hardened, borders bristled with artillery, and an atmosphere of fear settled over cities and deserts alike, because everyone knew something was about to break, but no one knew how fast it would happen or how far the consequences would travel across history. The story of the Six-Day War does not begin with gunfire alone. It begins with tension that stretched across years, as Israel, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan watched one another with suspicion, each side convinced that the next move could determine survival, honor, territory, and power in a volatile region. People in Israel remembered the wars of 1948 and 1956, still carrying the memory of existential threat, while many in the Arab world saw unresolved grievances, displaced populations, and promises of reclaiming lost dignity that echoed through political speeches and radio broadcasts. Soldiers stood in trenches along borders, families stocked food and water, leaders held emergency meetings deep into sleepless nights, and the landscape itself felt charged, as if sand dunes and mountains were waiting to witness another violent chapter in the region's story. As troop movements accelerated in the weeks leading up to June, maps in war rooms grew crowded with arrows and circles, airfields filled with fighters being checked and rechecked by mechanics, and generals studied intelligence reports that predicted catastrophic battles if war erupted. Egypt's decision to move troops into the Sinai Peninsula and the announcement of the blockade of the Straits of Tiran raised tension dramatically, while Israel viewed the blockade not merely as a political gesture but as an existential threat to its maritime lifeline. Across radios in Cairo, Damascus, Amman, and Tel Aviv, speeches became sharper, crowds listened anxiously, and international diplomats shuttled between capitals hoping to slow a momentum that seemed to be rushing toward conflict despite every warning. The United Nations debated resolutions, global powers issued statements, and yet the sense of inevitability grew, because mistrust had already become so deep that words no longer felt like protection against tanks and aircraft. Ordinary people felt that pressure in real time. Israeli civilians worried about being surrounded by multiple armies, and Arab civilians heard constant promises that a decisive confrontation might soon reshape the map. Young men in uniform wrote hurried letters home, telling families not to worry while secretly feeling the weight of uncertainty pressing on their chests. Border villages listened for distant rumbling that might be tanks, mothers tried to calm children who sensed fear in adult conversations, and every sunrise felt heavier than the last. In these moments before the war officially began, history was building its momentum in silence, in the sound of boots on sand, in the roar of engines warming on airstrips, and in commanders staring at clocks as they calculated not just strategies but the possible cost in lives if they acted too late or too soon. The politics behind the tension were complex and layered, shaped by regional rivalries, nationalism, Cold War influence, and unresolved disputes from earlier conflicts. Arab leaders faced internal and external pressure to demonstrate strength, while Israeli leaders believed they were running out of time as hostile forces closed around them. The borders around the Gaza Strip, West Bank, Sinai, and Golan Heights seemed less like lines on a map and more like sensitive nerves. One spark could electrify the entire region. News of military alliances, troop concentrations, and mutual defense agreements circulated rapidly, increasing fear that if war came, it would not be a slow grinding conflict but a fast-moving storm involving multiple fronts at once. This was the emotional stage on which the Six-Day War was about to unfold, a mixture of dread, determination, and suspense so thick that even global audiences far from the region paid close attention, wondering whether the clash could expand into something even larger. By the first days of June 1967, diplomats were nearly out of options, armies were already positioned, and the final question was no longer whether tension existed but when the first shot would be fired and who would make the first decisive move. That moment was approaching at remarkable speed, and within days the world would witness a conflict that would last less than a week yet alter borders, politics, and human lives for generations. Politics behind the Six-Day War formed a tightening web of decisions, miscalculations, pride, fear, and strategic positioning in which every leader believed they were responding defensively while their opponents interpreted the same actions as preparations for attack. In the months before June 1967, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser's growing reputation as a pan-Arab leader played a central role, as many in the Arab world looked to him as the figure who might reverse earlier military disappointments and unite neighboring states against Israel. His speeches were broadcast across the region, promising strength and resistance, and those words built enormous expectations among crowds who wanted to see dramatic change rather than another cycle of negotiations. At the same time, Israel's leadership watched its borders closely, aware that hostile rhetoric was being matched by real military deployments, and the country's small geographic size made even limited troop movements near its frontiers feel like an existential danger. The closure of the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping, following the withdrawal of United Nations peacekeeping forces from Sinai at Egypt's request, became one of the most decisive political steps because it transformed diplomatic tension into a direct challenge that threatened Israel's economy and security. Behind public speeches and newspaper headlines, quiet diplomatic conversations unfolded as global powers tried to prevent escalation while also pursuing their own strategic interests during the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union watched carefully, each worried that a regional war might spiral into a superpower confrontation, yet neither could fully control the rapidly hardening positions of their regional partners. Jordan and Egypt signed a defense pact, later joined in coordination with Syria, reinforcing the image for Israeli leaders that multiple fronts could ignite simultaneously. For Arab leaders, these pacts symbolized unity and strength. For Israel, they represented encirclement and the possibility of fighting several armies at once, stretching its forces to the breaking point. Every military parade, every troop deployment, and every public statement added another layer of pressure, and within this environment even ambiguous signals were interpreted in the most threatening way possible. Intelligence assessments on all sides emphasized worst-case scenarios. Arab governments believed Israel might launch a sudden preemptive strike to secure military superiority, while Israeli intelligence warned that waiting too long could allow surrounding armies to coordinate and strike first with devastating results. Airfields, radar stations, armored divisions, and artillery batteries became central in strategic planning because everyone understood that whoever controlled the skies and moved fastest on the ground would likely shape the outcome of the conflict. Military advisors updated maps daily, calculating distances between opposing forces measured not just in kilometers but in minutes of flight time for attacking aircraft. Mistakes in communication, overconfidence in propaganda broadcasts, and the psychological effect of mass troop movements fed into a cycle where de-escalation became increasingly difficult. The political atmosphere was not only about leaders and generals, it also involved public opinion and expectations that narrowed room for compromise. Crowds that heard fiery speeches began to expect decisive action, and leaders feared appearing weak if they backed down. Israeli society braced itself in deep uncertainty, with thousands of reservists called up, leaving jobs and families to wait near the borders while radio stations provided constant updates. In Arab capitals, patriotic songs, bold rhetoric, and promises of change encouraged the belief that a turning point in the struggle over territory and identity might be near. When the United Nations attempted further mediation, proposals often arrived too late or were viewed with suspicion by one side or the other, and the sense that momentum was slipping toward conflict became almost impossible to reverse. Diplomatic cables from embassies around the world warned that one decisive action could trigger a chain reaction, and that is exactly what was forming as June approached. Each government publicly insisted that it did not want war while simultaneously preparing intensely for it, which revealed the deep contradiction at the heart of the crisis. Israel's cabinet debated whether a preemptive strike was necessary to survive and avoid being overwhelmed, while Arab leaders believed their military posture signaled deterrence and strength, not inevitability of immediate war. Yet deterrence became indistinguishable from provocation in such a charged environment. Decisions taken in those tense days were influenced by years of unresolved disputes over borders, refugees, recognition, and security guarantees. So when the final hours before the outbreak of war arrived, they carried the full weight of accumulated history. By the time June 1967 began, politics had pushed the region to a narrow ledge where one further step would mean open conflict. Diplomacy had failed to defuse the crisis, mutual suspicion reached its peak, and armies stood face to face across desert expanses, mountain ridges, and contested cities. The leaders involved were fully aware that the coming clash could be fast, destructive, and transformative, yet backing down now seemed politically impossible after so many public promises and military preparations. The world would soon see how decisions made in meeting rooms, broadcast through microphones, and reinforced by troop movements would burst into reality on the battlefield, as the opening strikes of the Six-Day War turned political pressure into explosive action that would reshape the map in less than a week. When the war finally erupted in June 1967, it began with a speed and decisiveness that stunned not only the region but observers across the world, as the tense silence of waiting suddenly broke into the roar of aircraft engines and the rapid movement of armored columns across hot desert terrain. In the early morning hours, Israel launched a massive preemptive strike against Egyptian airfields, sending waves of aircraft flying low across the Mediterranean and Sinai to avoid radar. And within hours, large portions of Egypt's air force were damaged or destroyed on the ground. The sudden loss of aircraft dramatically shifted the balance of power, because control of the skies meant that every movement on land risked being seen and targeted, and commanders on the Arab side struggled to communicate clearly in the shock of those opening blows. Confusion spread through radio channels, reports came in faster than they could be verified, and the realization that a full-scale war had begun sank in as plumes of smoke rose from runways and bases that only hours earlier had been quiet. While the air campaign transformed the strategic picture, fighting quickly expanded on multiple fronts. In the Sinai Peninsula, Israeli ground forces moved rapidly, pushing through desert roads toward key Egyptian positions, while in the West Bank and Jerusalem tension escalated between Israeli and Jordanian forces as artillery exchanges and urban firefights erupted in areas already deeply symbolic and emotionally charged. Along the Golan Heights, the Syrian front grew increasingly active, with artillery duels shaking villages and military posts perched along rugged high ground that offered commanding views over territory below. The pace of events became dizzying, as maps changed daily and sometimes hourly, and families listening to radios struggled to keep up with which cities and strategic points were under whose control. For many soldiers, the war felt less like a carefully staged campaign and more like a whirlwind in which decisions had to be made instantly, under intense pressure and uncertainty. The early days were marked not only by military success and rapid maneuver but by the human experience of shock, fear, and determination. Pilots who took off at dawn returned to bases hours later unsure of what they would find, while tank crews advanced through swirling dust clouds, aware that a single mistake could mean disaster. In cities, air raid sirens wailed, civilians sheltered in stairwells and basements, and prayers, whispered conversations, and the distant thunder of explosions blended into a surreal atmosphere where ordinary life paused and everything revolved around survival and news from the front. Medical teams worked non-stop, ambulances rushed back and forth, and telephones rang endlessly as families tried to learn whether loved ones were safe. The war, though driven by politics and strategy, was experienced most intensely in these personal, anxious moments where time seemed to move both too fast and painfully slow at once. As Israel's initial airstrike success became clearer, the strategic momentum shifted rapidly in its favor. Egyptian units in the Sinai faced growing pressure as Israeli forces advanced with coordination between ground and air elements that made it difficult to regroup effectively. Orders and counterorders crossed in the chaos, and some units withdrew under heavy strain, contributing to a sense of disarray that spread across broader formations. In Jerusalem, intense fighting around key neighborhoods and strategic points underscored how symbolic this city was for both sides, and every block and hill carried layers of history that heightened the emotional weight of the battle. Meanwhile, Jordanian and Syrian decisions were influenced by conflicting reports about the situation in Egypt, which sometimes led to actions based on outdated or incomplete information, further complicating the unfolding conflict. Internationally, governments and news agencies struggled to understand how a war expected to be prolonged had instead turned into a fast-moving series of dramatic developments. Diplomatic calls intensified, emergency meetings were held at the United Nations, and the fear that the conflict might broaden into a larger regional or global confrontation briefly hung over the proceedings. Yet on the ground, soldiers and civilians were focused not on geopolitics but on immediate realities. Advancing columns, damaged infrastructure, closed roads, and the uncertainty of what the next hour might bring. The idea that a war of such scale could last less than a week seemed unthinkable at its beginning. However, the pace of Israeli advances and the mounting operational difficulties faced by opposing forces began to suggest that this conflict would not follow the slow, grinding pattern of many earlier wars. Despite the rapid shifts, the cost of war was unmistakable from the very beginning. Both sides experienced losses in lives and equipment, families mourned, and cities carried scars that would remain long after the smoke cleared. The psychological impact was profound. For Israelis, the initial success brought relief mixed with continued anxiety that the war was not yet over and other fronts might still erupt. For many in the Arab world, shock and disbelief accompanied the realization that expectations of a different outcome were colliding with harsh military realities. Yet in the midst of all this, fighting continued with intensity, because even as outcomes began to take shape, the participants were still locked in engagements across deserts, hills, and urban areas. By the third and fourth days of the conflict, it became increasingly evident that territorial changes were unfolding at extraordinary speed. Israeli forces deepened their control in the Sinai, made significant gains in the West Bank including East Jerusalem, and prepared for decisive action on the Golan Heights. Each new advance altered the strategic map, created new political calculations, and raised questions about what the post-war reality would look like once the guns fell silent. The early stage of the Six-Day War had begun with sudden strikes and rapid movement, and it was now evolving toward its decisive moments, as commanders on all sides recognized that the direction of history was being shaped not in distant conference rooms but in the dust, smoke, and tension of active battlefields spread across the region. As the days of fighting continued through the middle phase of the Six-Day War, the speed of events did not reduce the seriousness of the human cost. Instead, the intensity of movement, the rapid changes in control, and the constant pressure on soldiers and civilians created a situation where exhaustion, fear, and loss were felt everywhere, even as maps were being redrawn at unprecedented pace. Israeli advances in the Sinai turned long stretches of desert into corridors of retreat and pursuit, where damaged vehicles, abandoned equipment, and hastily dug positions testified to the strain of continuous combat. Egyptian units, under heavy air pressure and facing communication breakdowns, attempted to withdraw across narrow desert routes that quickly became overcrowded, and in this chaos many soldiers found themselves cut off, running out of fuel, food, and clear orders. The cost in lives rose sharply, not only from direct combat but also from accidents, dehydration, and the confusion that follows when large formations move rapidly under fire. In the West Bank, fighting in and around populated areas meant that civilians were never far from danger. Homes shook from artillery blasts, streets were scarred by tank tracks, and people who had gone to sleep days earlier expecting tension now found themselves in the middle of an active war zone. In Jerusalem, the emotional weight of history collided with the reality of urban conflict. Streets sacred to multiple faiths echoed with gunfire, and soldiers on both sides understood that they were fighting not only for strategic ground but for places that carried centuries of religious and cultural meaning. The reunification of Israeli forces with the old city would soon become symbolic, but during the battle itself what dominated experience was fear, dust, shattered stone, and the voices of commanders urging troops forward while medics worked frantically to treat the wounded wherever they fell. For Jordanian forces, the defense of positions around East Jerusalem and the West Bank involved trying to hold lines under severe air and ground pressure, and as the tide turned, many soldiers faced impossible decisions between continuing resistance and withdrawing to save remaining lives. Families huddled in interior rooms away from windows, counting seconds between explosions, hoping electricity and water would last long enough to get through the worst of the fighting. Far to the north, the confrontation with Syria over the Golan Heights carried its own distinct harshness. The elevated terrain provided commanding views and made positions difficult and dangerous to attack, so battles there involved steep slopes, narrow approaches, and constant threat from artillery positioned on the heights. Israeli forces preparing to take the Golan understood the sacrifice that such terrain demanded, while Syrian defenders knew that yielding the high ground would transform the strategic balance in the region. Villages below the plateau had already spent years under intermittent shelling before the war, and now they faced the possibility of decisive change as armies maneuvered for control. The fighting here was intense and personal, shaped by geography as much as by orders from headquarters, and every hill captured or lost represented both tactical advantage and human cost. Throughout these days, hospitals on all sides overflowed with wounded, and medical teams performed exhausting work under extreme pressure. Blood banks ran low, corridors were crowded, and the sounds of distant fighting mixed with the cries of injured soldiers and civilians brought in from surrounding areas. Families searched lists of casualties, listened desperately to radio updates, and sometimes traveled long distances just to learn whether someone was alive or missing. War statistics would later summarize numbers of killed and wounded, but during the conflict those numbers represented individual faces, interrupted lives, halted futures, and grief that spread across entire communities. Infrastructure damage added to the suffering. Bridges were destroyed, roads were blocked, fields were burned, and communication lines were severed, making it difficult for emergency services to reach those who needed help most urgently. At the same time, the psychological impact of rapid territorial change was enormous. For Israelis, the shock of initial fear gave way to a sense of momentum as news of advances arrived, but this feeling was tempered by constant awareness that fighting continued and casualties mounted. For many in the Arab world, the sudden reversals created waves of disbelief, anger, sorrow, and introspection, as expectations created by political rhetoric collided with battlefield outcomes. Leaders struggled to explain the situation to their populations while also managing ongoing military operations, and international media carried images and reports that revealed both the speed of Israeli successes and the depth of regional trauma. Foreign diplomats pressed urgently for ceasefire arrangements, fearing that each additional day of combat would increase losses and harden political positions even further. By the fifth and sixth days, exhaustion weighed heavily on everyone involved. Soldiers who had barely slept since the first strikes continued to operate under relentless strain, vehicles wore the marks of constant use, and supply chains stretched to keep pace with advancing formations. The battlefield became not just a place of maneuver but of reflection, as those present recognized that they were witnessing a turning point that would shape borders, politics, and personal histories for decades. The war was short in duration but vast in consequence, and even before the final ceasefires were declared, it was clear that nothing in the region would return to exactly what it had been before June 1967. Yet amid all the strategic calculations and political implications, the most immediate reality remained the same. Families grieving their losses, cities marked by damage, and survivors carrying memories of fear and chaos that no map or treaty could erase. The mid-war phase of the Six-Day War revealed how quickly history can accelerate, how decisions made in moments can echo across generations, and how the price of conflict is measured not only in territory gained or lost but in the human lives changed forever because of it. When the guns finally began to fall silent after 6 extraordinary days, the Middle East woke up to a map that looked dramatically different and to a future that felt both uncertain and permanently altered, because what had happened in less than a week reshaped politics, identity, and the balance of power across the region for generations to come. Israel now controlled the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank including East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights, territories whose names would echo through countless debates, peace negotiations, and conflicts long after 1967. The swift military victory carried immense strategic implications. Israel's borders were pushed outward, buffer zones emerged, and the psychological perception of Israel in the region shifted from vulnerability to significant military strength. But victory in war never comes without cost, and alongside territorial gains lay the realities of casualties, displacement, grief, and the deepening of unresolved questions about land, refugees, sovereignty, and recognition that would continue to shape regional tensions. For the Arab states involved, the defeat triggered national mourning, political repercussions, and introspection about leadership, military readiness, and the promises made to their populations before the fighting began. Internationally, the consequences of the Six-Day War rippled far beyond the immediate battlefield. The Cold War powers reassessed their strategies in the Middle East, arms flows and alliances changed, and global diplomacy increasingly revolved around UN resolutions addressing occupied territories and the need for negotiations to achieve a lasting settlement. United Nations Security Council Resolution 242, calling for withdrawal from territories occupied in the conflict and the right of all states in the area to live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries, became a central reference point in diplomacy for decades. Yet translating words into reality would prove far more difficult than drafting resolutions, because the human emotions tied to land, history, and security were too powerful to be resolved quickly. Families displaced by fighting, communities suddenly living under new administration, and soldiers who had survived the war all carried personal memories that could not be erased by diplomatic language. In many places, the sense that history had sharply turned a corner in 1967 became part of everyday conversation, shaping how people understood their past and imagined their future. The aftermath also revealed how short wars can cast long shadows. Checkpoints, borders, and ceasefire lines turned into defining features of daily life, and the questions raised by the captured territories became central to later conflicts, peace initiatives, and international negotiations. The reunification of Israeli control over East Jerusalem held enormous symbolic meaning for Israelis, while for Palestinians and the wider Arab world it intensified feelings of loss, occupation, and unresolved national aspirations. The Golan Heights, with its strategic high ground, became both a military asset and a diplomatic challenge, while the Sinai Peninsula would eventually become the focus of negotiations leading to later peace agreements. Each piece of territory carried layers of political and emotional meaning, ensuring that the Six-Day War would not be remembered only as a brief military campaign but as a turning point that set the stage for everything that followed in the region. For individuals who lived through it, the statistics of armies and borders translated into memories of sirens, evacuations, reunions, funerals, and the strange quiet that arrives after intense conflict ends. Veterans on all sides spent years reflecting on what they had seen in deserts, cities, and mountains during those 6 days, and many civilians remembered exactly where they were when news of sudden advances or ceasefires came over the radio. The sense of suspense that had marked the days before the war evolved into a sense of consequence afterward, as people understood that the choices made by leaders, the movements of armies, and the outcomes of battles now formed part of the region's permanent historical landscape. Schools, books, documentaries, and political speeches would return again and again to June 1967, analyzing its causes and effects, arguing over interpretations, and recognizing its role in shaping the ongoing search for peace and security in the Middle East. Even decades later, the Six-Day War remains a subject of intense study because it combined rapid military action with deep historical and political roots, reminding the world how quickly events can accelerate when fear, mistrust, and strategic calculation converge. The legacy of those 6 days is visible not only on maps but in negotiations, policies, and the lived experiences of millions of people whose lives intersected with the consequences of the conflict. It is a reminder that wars, no matter how brief, leave marks that last far longer than their duration, and that understanding history is essential to understanding the present reality of the region and the possibilities of its future. And now, as we conclude this narration of the Six-Day War of 1967, if you feel that our videos are giving you clear and valuable information about history and major battles, then make sure to support our journey by liking this video, subscribing to our channel, and pressing the bell notification button so you can watch our latest episodes in this war series as soon as they are released.